Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. As we've been going through the Psalms, we've come across several times where David is speaking about his enemies. These Psalms where he's basically calling judgment down on his enemies before God. And we've explored kind of the way that we can kind of relate that to us. And we saw that, the enemy that we might be wrestling with may be a mental enemy like depression, some type of emotion that we're struggling with, some type of mental problem that we're dealing with. Or it could also be something physical, like David was dealing with. It could be actually another person rising up against us, slandering us, speaking against us, and working evil against us. Or it could also be related to the spiritual realm. We also explored that we don't really wrestle against flesh and blood, as Ephesians chapter 6 talks about, but our warfare is against the spiritual forces of darkness in the heavenly places. And we've looked at all that before, but now as we get into Romans chapter 3, we see perhaps the most shocking view of the enemies of David and Israel, as Paul goes in and he actually quotes a lot of the Psalms that we are reading. In Romans chapter 3, starting verse 9, it says, "What then, are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." Pretty much that whole section is quotations from the Psalms. The only exception is verses 15, 16, and 17, which are quoted from Isaiah 59. But in all of these, you can find a context within the psalm that speaks about either the enemies of David or the enemies of Israel. And as we go through here and we read about there's none righteous, not even one, there's none who understands, there's none who seeks after God. That's all can be found from Psalm 53. Actually, 53 and 14 are very similar, so these could actually be quotations from either one. Verse 12, all have turned aside together. They have become useless. There's none who does good, not even one. Again, either Psalm 53 or Psalm 14. Psalm 9 can be connected to verse 13, which talks about their throat is an open grave. I'm sorry, Psalm 5, verse 9. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps under their lips. That's from Psalm 140 in verse 3. And then the lack of reverence in verse 18. There's no fear of God before their eyes. Chapter 36 and verse 1 of Psalms. And again, all this is related much to the enemies of David or Israel. What's interesting is that Paul uses these. And this might be a little strange because as we're going through here, we're reading Romans, we're seeing Romans chapter 1, talking about how humanity had kind of fallen, probably more relating to the Gentiles. We saw in chapter 2, the Jews who had also failed in their calling before God. And then in chapter 3, Paul is kind of putting a bow around it all and saying, we've charged that all have sinned. Both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. And then he goes into these Psalms that are talking about the enemies of David and the enemies of Israel. And we might think there's a disconnect there because in the Psalms, David's not necessarily, maybe with the exception of 53 and 14, he's not really making a accusation against all humanity. It's against his enemies. But Paul's using it to relate to all humanity. Everybody in the human race has fallen into these types of sins. So what is Paul telling us here? Well, what it shows is that we're all the enemies. And this is another way we can look at the enemies of David. Oftentimes as we're reading through the Psalms, we're thinking of the enemies as these wicked people who are coming up against David and Israel. And of course, they're presented that way. But at the same time, we just limit it to that and think, well, these are just some people that, are the offscouring of the earth. And, they're the people that God should render judgment on. But then when we get to Romans chapter 3, we realize, oh, wait, we're the enemies. We're the ones who have gone against God. We're the ones who are corrupt. Matter of fact, if you categorize these different things that Paul brings out from the Psalms, you find that in one way or the other, we can all relate to these things. As he says that there is none righteous, not even one. He also says there is none who understands, none who seeks after God. We've all become corrupted in our minds in one way or the other. None of us have perfect understanding, and none of us absolutely 100% seeks for God. We all reserve a little bit for ourselves. As much as we try to be devoted to the Lord and give our all to the Lord, there's none of us that 100% seeks after God in God's ways. They've all turned aside. They become useless. There's none who does good, not even one. In their actions, David's enemies have become corrupt, but we ourselves also have become corrupt in our actions. We can think of specific actions that we have taken in our lives where we have been corrupted. We've walked in a way that was contrary to God's will. And in our actions, we've been corrupted. We've all been shown corruption in our tongue. As verse 13 says, their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Now, maybe we wouldn't think of ourselves as going to the extreme as perhaps what's being shown in the Psalms. But in some degree, and in some extent, we've all used our tongues in the wrong way. We've all stuck our foot in our mouths. We've all spoken when we shouldn't have spoken, or maybe didn't speak when we should have spoke. The tongue is a fire of evil. James talks about that, and it's like an untamed animal that's uncontrollable. And we've all transgressed with our tongues. Our direction of life have all become corrupt. Verse 15, their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. Just our whole direction of life oftentimes gets off course, where we are seeking after our own things. Maybe sometimes we take advantage of other people. We become selfish, that sort of thing. And then we become corrupted in our lack of reverence for God. Verse 18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. And none of us perfectly, absolutely, to the extent that we should, give reverence to God. If we really saw God in all of his glory and who he is and his power and his might and his majesty and his sovereignty, we would have a whole lot more reverence for him than we have today, I'm sure. We haven't seen God. We haven't visibly seen God. And so oftentimes we don't really give him the reverence and the fear that he deserves. We should respect God to the utmost, but oftentimes we don't. And we show that by the actions that we take, the words that we speak, and the things that we do in this life. So as we go through and we read these different things and we see how they relate to the Psalms with these enemies of David and Israel, we can see that we're all enemies. Jews, Gentiles, Philistines, Amorites, whoever they are, we all have been the enemies. But the good news is that we found reconciliation through Jesus Christ. Just a couple of chapters over in Romans chapter 5 and verse 10, this is what Paul says. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So yes, we all have been enemies of God because of our corrupted ways, our corrupted mind, our corrupted actions, our tongue, our direction of life, our lack of reverence for God, at least absolute reverence for God. But the beautiful thing is that even while we were enemies, God reconciled us through the death of Jesus Christ. And so we don't have to be enemies anymore. Now we are part of the people of God. We're sons of God, children of God, and we can walk in a relationship with God, even though we have demonstrated a lot of these things that are similar to the enemies of God. And we can praise God today that through Jesus Christ, we've been reconciled. We have a restored relationship with God again, and we can walk with him hand in hand each and every day. So let's praise God for that. With that, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.